Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the week's top stories in the state of Washington. I'm Cole Lauterbach, managing editor for the Center Square Newswire service. This week, we'll be discussing Governor Jay Inslee's swan song calling for billions of dollars in new taxes. A county in Washington becoming the first to have to pay back COVID-19 benefit fraud. And a Seattle bus stop in an area so dangerous that the metro just rolls right by. That's ahead on Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach.
They're simple, boring, never thought of until they're needed. They're windshield wipers. Only when Mary Anderson became annoyed that New York trolley drivers were stopping to wipe their windshield by hand did anybody do something about it. By attaching a spring-loaded arm to a rubber blade, one woman made travel easier and safer. Look to innovate and pass it on. From passiton.com.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach. Now, let's jump into the headlines. Jay Inslee's time in Olympia is coming to an end. He gave his final budget address this week, saying the state isn't dealing with a recession, but they are suffering from a budget deficit. His proposal to fix it, billions of dollars in new taxes. Investigative reporter TJ Martinell covered the speech. How much more does the governor want to tax his residents, TJ?
He's calling for $4 billion in new taxes to the new budget.
Now, $4 billion, but we've heard the deficit is upwards of, now we're hearing $16 billion. Didn't he say $16 billion?
Yeah. So
is he planning on cutting 12?
The $16 billion represents the 4-year outlook. And so for the current budget, the shortfall is significantly less. So he's going to do $2 billion in delayed spending or some sort of just deferring down the road where it was going to be spending that they were planning to do, but they're not going to do, like raises and that kind of stuff. He's also going to be cutting spending or closing facilities for different departments. But the big thing is that he's proposing the wealth tax, which is going to make up the bulk of the new revenue. Like we're talking over $3 billion out of the $4 billion.
Now, a wealth tax, what are you taxing when it comes to wealth? When you're talking about a state that does not have an income tax because the Constitution says you can't do that.
And it's a good question because it's going to be dependent on what the bill language actually says for the tax. And what they would do is they would put a tax on the 1% of the wealth of residents whose wealth exceeds $100 million. So if you have $100 million, you pay 1% of tax on that wealth. And the governor believes that this would affect roughly 3,000 state residents. And they're going to try and tax, from what I understand, all of their wealth, not just the wealth that they have in Washington state, which is going to be interesting.
Right. The term worldwide wealth has come up before, and that has been seen largely as a non-starter for people that say, well, for one, you can't tax people's property in other states. And two, you especially can't tax somebody's account down in the Cayman Islands. If they could, the federal government would have tried to figure that out by now and change the law to do so. So in terms of, overall this, we have to remember that this is just kind of a suggestion. Really, it's not for him to do, right?
Yeah, it's not for him to do. It's a proposal, and the state budget writers with the Senate Ways Committee have noted that this is a starting point for discussion. So this is a proposal. This is not the final outlook or final policy that they're going to be enacting. But one of the problems with it also is that if they try to make it a property tax, we have a state constitutional provision that requires that all property be taxed uniformly in terms of rates by class. So not only are they going to have to list off every class of property that they're taxing, it's got to be uniform in nature. And our state constitution also has one of the broadest definitions of property, which is all things tangible and intangible subject to ownership. So anything that they're trying to tax that somebody else owns is going to be considered property. So that's going to be another legal challenge that they're going to have to contend with if they want to enact this sort of thing. And, with the capital with the income tax on capital gains, they called that an excise tax. And that was the way that they were able to get that to get clear through the state Supreme Court. It's very difficult to see how they're going to be able to do that with this by calling it something else, but we'll see what happens.
And plus, you have to think that, property in its very nebulous definition in Washington, like all property, has depreciation schedules, has value based on age, on location, and who sets that. And if you get real quiet, you can almost hear the keyboards clattering away of financial advisors across the country, ready to properly classify the property that is going to be assessed by Washington, Department of Revenue, Attorney General, whoever, as fully depreciated, and thus negate any other assessment of wealth that they would like to try and tax. Now, Bob Ferguson is going to take over, and he is going to be the one at the helm to either sign or affect or influence this proposal, which it appears as though Governor Inslee is saying this is the big one. What's he said about it?
I don't believe he's put out any kind of statement right now. I know that the budget writers, like I mentioned, had put out a very, what I would describe as, they called it a thoughtful and future focused and a budget and a strong starting point for the work in the Senate. So again, Senator Robinson, who's the chair of the Senate Ways and Means Committee, has put out neutral statements so far without saying whether or not she supports the new taxes or the new spending, but just saying that they're going to look at it. The ranking minority member, Chris Gilden, was much more critical, saying that, he's proposing a double-digit spending increase in his first budget, when Inslee was first in, and he's basically spending more and more and more every biennium. And so, as he put it, tax and spend at the end.
Yeah, he was the one that pointed out that Governor Inslee initially in his campaign, back when Prince was a symbol, said that new taxes are not the path for Washington right now, and then gets elected and proceeds to include a new tax of one form or fashion every single budget that he signed off on since then. Yeah,
there's been about 50 new taxes over the past, I'd say, decade, at least. And so there's been a lot of new taxes, or there's been, and that probably includes tax increases. And with that has been the subsequent spending increases that has, as of right now, outpaced the revenue, which is hence why you have a shortfall.
Right. And one thing that he said stuck out to me was that he tried to justify it by saying Washington's tax. He said something about Washington's tax burden being under the average and being lower than either he thought it could be or what his analysts say it could be. I looked into it, and the Tax Foundation, which does an annual tax burden per capita, has them at 12th in the nation, or 13th in the nation, in terms of average tax burden, total tax burden per person. And it's notable to me because they do this without an income tax. Right. There was no other state that even was close to them that had no income tax. That's remarkable.
Yeah, and that was interesting that he was saying how it's a bit below average on the revenue that it generates, and yet they're getting more revenue than they ever have before.
Right. This record revenue.
Yeah, they're not struggling. And he even mentioned that the state economy was doing well. So it raises the question of how much money does he think it should be generating?
That's a great question. Yeah. God save you if you guys actually do see a recession coming up here in the next couple of years, because my goodness, if this is what they're looking at to raise revenue now, if you actually do see a recession, that Katie bar the door, right? Thank you, TJ. When the federal government sent out hundreds of billions of dollars to help in the COVID-19 recovery without the economy crashing, state and local governments doled out these funds under strict but ultimately unenforced guidelines. Now, Washington County is the first unit of government that we know of to have to send back to Washington, D.C. funds that they had given out. Capitol correspondent Carlene Johnson covered the settlement. Carlene, what happened?
Yeah, so Thurston County, like counties all across the nation received millions of dollars from the federal government during COVID to help people who had lost their jobs and couldn't make the rent payment. So Thurston County got $32.5 million from the feds for what they call these ERA programs. That stands for Emergency Rent Assistance. So they got $32.5 million, and then they contracted with a nonprofit called Community Action Council starting in February of 2021. The Community Action Council agreed to basically, do the heavy lifting on it. So take the applications from people that the county got for this emergency rent assistance, and then process that and go, okay, yeah, actually, you've been vetted, you've lost your job, you can't make the rent payment for however many months in a row, and we're going to help you pay that off. Problem is, there wasn't a whole heck of a lot of actual vetting going on of people that were applying for this rent assistance.
Did you say 32 million?
$32.5 million is what they got from the feds for the program. Now, $668,000 roughly is what was identified as having been, doled out to people who shouldn't have actually been able to qualify for emergency rent assistance. So that's the amount that U.S. Treasury is saying now, and the Office of Inspector General is saying to Thurston County, your own internal audits, and we confirm this $668,000 that you guys doled out to people for rent assistance, it was fraud, and you got to pay it back.
And now, what is Thurston's excuse here? What are county officials saying? Oh, well, this is, because they're claiming that they shouldn't be responsible for this $600,000, right?
Right. They're basically saying, well, we contracted with this Community Action Council folks. Right. A year later, they severed that contract when they started kind of questioning some of the payouts, and the nonprofit went, we're operating on your rules. But that's been Thurston County's sort of explanation. They said, we went by the rules that were mandated by the federal government. Low barrier program, get the checks out fast, right? Especially for folks that lost their jobs and were facing potential eviction during the pandemic. And so Thurston County, in an emailed statement to me, they said, let's see, the balance between expediency and thoroughness in verifying applications has been a challenging one, which was made particularly difficult due to the allowance of self-attestation and the lowering of certain barriers for applicants. So basically, you had people filling out these applications online because offices weren't open, right? Don't come in person and prove you lost your job. Fill it out online. Say I've worked at Starbucks, whatever, for the last year. I'm laid off indefinitely. My rent's $1,200 this month. I'm already a month behind, and they just paid the rent for them. Now, the problem with that, Cole, is that in many cases, scammers figured that out. It's not unique to Thurston County, right? But sure. The different scenarios, in some cases, you had people filling out addresses for houses that weren't even theirs, saying, I've got, two renters in here and neither of them can pay the rent. So me, property owner, I deserve compensation. Well, they didn't even check the address to see if in fact there were renters at that address. Checks just went to said
went there.
I mean, but there's various scenarios for how, the fraudsters took advantage of this. But ultimately, the buck is being passed from Thurston County now to Lacey. They're asking Lacey police to get involved because Lacey is the location where this nonprofit was located, right? Lacey police say, well, the Community Action Council people are saying they don't think that they're fraud victims, that they did everything the right way. They were acting by what Thurston County said to do. Since they don't say they're a victim and they didn't file a police report, Lacey PD are saying, we don't have a victim from our jurisdiction. They sent it back to the county. Meantime, the county is saying, no, it's not our baby to take care of. Somebody else has to follow up with this. Thurston County Sheriff's Office said basically they didn't have the resources to properly look into it. So everybody's kind of backing up going, this is not our issue. And ultimately right now, it is the obligation of Thurston County to repay this $668,000 to the federal government unless the government gives them a bit of a pass, which they're asking for at this point.
Ah, there it is. Okay. So the official response is, look what you made me do. I get it.
That's a really, really concise way of putting it. These were your rules, federal government. We just obliged. And now you're coming back and, penalizing us. That's not fair.
Meanwhile, they're asking to be paid out in Target gift cards, thinking nothing is suspect about this. Okay.
Right.
All right. Thank you, Carlene. I cannot wait to see the federal government lower the hammer on them, because if anyone has ever dealt with the federal government when they owe them money, oh boy, Thurston County might just find out. Thank you. Like many other units of government, COVID funds elsewhere are drying up, and officials who spent that money on recurring expenses are now facing a reckoning. Spokane has been cutting and saving with the best of them in recent months, and they say their new budget closes the gap. Eastern Washington reporter Tim Clauser reported on revenue reports that show the coming months could show that the city efforts could come up short, however. What's the issue, Tim?
Well, Spokane is grappling with the same issues as others across the state, but not just with COVID funding drying up, but also sales tax collections. Now, that's not to say that people aren't spending money in the city of Spokane, because the city generates over $12 billion annually in sales taxes, while its budget is only about $1.2 billion. Problem is that collections aren't staying on top of projections. While Spokane is only entitled to a small portion of that, around $12 billion a year, anything they come up on short will affect their end of year finances.
Right. So, I mean, it's misleading to say, well, they bring in 12 billion, but you have to differentiate the fact that they get what? It's a tiny percentage of that 12 billion. And then the rest of, state, county, different jurisdictions and bond repayments. There's a whole, just an onion full of governmental agencies, and they all take their statutory allowed cut. Now, how short do these new reports say that the city could end up coming?
Well, I think there's a little bit of a lens to it. Now, the former administration budgeted about a 2.5% sales tax growth over 2024. Now, Mayor Lisa Brown and her administration scaled that back down to 1.2% after taking office in January. That was largely due to the $25 million deficit. But you mentioned that they think that they solved with their new budget. A city spokesperson told me that year-over-year growth is currently at about 1.02%. So they're about less than 0.25% behind budget, but that's after averaging around 4% growth each year for about 2 decades until 2023. So after doing some math, they're about $19 million short in terms of sales tax collection, but still kind of a drop in the bucket compared to the 12 billion-ish that they generate annually.
Right. Now, what happens if a city in Washington comes up short?
Yeah. Now, Spokane needs to come out on top. And if they come up short, it's probably going to lead to additional state oversight. How much oversight? I'm not exactly sure. I've reached out to the city and they pointed me to the state, and I've asked the state, and I'm still waiting for them to get back to me. Now, there are
to tell you to go look back at the city is what they're going to tell you.
Yeah, most likely there are state laws that you can find that hold city officials accountable. Now, the mayor could face fines up to $500 for each expense that they make in excess of revenues for the year. And that's in addition to a misdemeanor charge. So there is some consequences to going over, but we won't really know exactly until we get to that year end.
Right. But and it's not even the year end, because what happens is each quarter is the reports come out quarterly on sales tax and revenue projections and stuff like that, or revenue receipts come in. But in terms of quarterly numbers, you're not going to see likely Q4 numbers until midway through the first couple months of 2025, correct?
Yeah, Cole, those collections usually happen towards the end, if not after the end of that fiscal quarter. So that's why we're just now starting to get data from September, the end of Q3. So it's going to be a little bit till we know how the city ends exactly. It is worth noting that they do have, they're under budget right now in terms of general fund, about 1.3 million. So there is a little bit of a cushion there. but that's still not a lot. So it'll probably be February till we know exactly how things pan out. But the city spokesperson told me that they're confident in the Q4 numbers and how things are going so far. So they're crossing their fingers, but it's not always a good thing to be crossing your fingers hoping that you're going to come out on top.
Well, good luck, Spokane residents. Buy local. Thank you, Tim. Seattle's leaders have taken steps to make its streets safer. Problem areas are still affecting life in the Emerald City. Seattle reporter Spencer Pauly had a story this week about how one area is so dangerous that the city's bus service now plans to drive right by. Explain this area, Spencer.
There's two bus stops located along 12th Avenue South and South Jackson Street. Now, this is in the Little Saigon neighborhood, and that's just east of the Chinatown International District. It's been kind of rough there lately, and a King County Metro spokesperson told me basically that they've gotten too many reports from drivers, passengers, and other Metro employees that they just feel unsafe there and even if they have to get dropped off in that area, they will wait till the next bus stop. It's been getting pretty bad there.
I mean, I went to college in Chicago, and there were some really rough neighborhoods on the bus routes there. And I do not recall a time when they just simply said, this stop is too dangerous. We're just going to roll through. I mean, they may have done it without telling anybody. That's kind of the Chicago way. But with these couple stops, what are the recent events that have led up to this decision being made?
Well, the most notable incident happened last month, in which there were 10 stabbings along that corridor within 36 hours. Now, that gained national attention. I've had family members back in Ohio ask me if I'm okay because I live in Seattle. I'm far away from this area. But to hear that, that it's a pretty big deal. And that's just the most notable incident, but this area has had a bad reputation for the past couple of years now, and I have walked it before. I've stumbled upon it, and it's one of those areas where you sense it's unsafe and start to pick up the pace a bit if you're walking. But there are a lot of small businesses along there, especially from foreign residents, immigrants, and you just kind of feel sorry for them because of the situation they have to deal with and having to handle more public safety concerns.
Yeah. And the latest episode of violence on the Metro came, Tuesday night into Wednesday morning, right?
Yeah, 3 a.m. on Wednesday morning here. There's a incident north of the area we're talking about here in the University District, in which a Metro driver was stabbed to death after an altercation. This came right after I published the story and just kind of shows the growing concern, not just in this area for King County Metro riders and drivers, but across the city of Seattle. And that's going to be something to look at in the future here.
Now, the total violent crime in Seattle is it still on the rise, or has it leveled off or even dropped?
It has dropped. 2022 was an unprecedented year for crime here in Seattle. But to say that things have gotten better is tough for me to say, I suppose. Numbers are still high. We can look at just the International District, which is a rough neighborhood, had 250 reports of violent crime so far through November this year. That includes 3 homicides. Now, that's not as bad as 2022, where there were 7 homicides in that area. I think one thing to note is that out of all the Seattle neighborhoods, districts, the Chinatown International District ranked 4th out of Seattle neighborhoods for cases of violent crime through November. They trail the Downtown Commercial District, Northgate, and Capitol Hill, which is a neighborhood that has seen the most amount of cases of violent crime so far this year.
Now, and one thing that I learned is districts and areas, or neighborhoods or boroughs, depending on if you're in New York City or not, that are have very high percentages of immigrant population. When crime does happen there, it adds another layer of difficulty for police to actually solve it, because there is you gotta admit, and police will tell you, there's a level of distrust there with people that are not, that have recently come to this country, and let alone a language barrier. And I wonder if that is a factor in these areas of high crime that also kind of coincide somewhat with high immigrant districts.
I never actually thought about that, Cole, but that is a very interesting point, because these are the areas where it's all happening. Now, some people can point to city officials for maybe pushing homelessness towards these populations who can't really handle it. And there's that language barrier, as you say. But that is something that is interesting to note for sure. Now, Seattle Police Department, amid the staff shortage, they do have some services that connect, victims or people who call the police to someone who speaks their language. But that just adds,
that's another layer.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, what are they doing? Is there the SOTA or SOPA or what's the new rule, the new policy that was old and then new again that was recently implemented? Is this area where the 10 stabbings in 36 hours occurred? Is that one of those areas?
It was one of the original areas included in the SOTA law, which is the Stay Out of Drug Areas Notice law, which was passed earlier this year. Establishes these areas, including Little Saigon and the Chinatown International District, in which any defendant caught doing drugs there cannot return to that area. Now, the question is, how is that going to be enforced, and will it be enforced effectively? To be determined. There's not much data on that yet, but that is something we'll definitely look at to make sure and see this law, if it works, if it helps, and based on the 10 stabbings, who knows?
They need all the help they can get. My goodness. Thank you, Spencer. And a big thank you to all of our journalists for sharing their stories. Stay up to date with these and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Cole Lauterbach. And until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.